in 1957. But the Pilgrims had a boat similar to this, I will say, built for them in Plymouth. It was taken apart and put in the hold of the Mayflower. When they got to Plymouth, they took it apart. I guess they rousted it out of the hold and floated the pieces to the beach at Provincetown, put it together, and then they used it to explore the boat over here, and then the Mayflower followed the shallop over to Plymouth. So really, if you think about it, the shallop was the first boat to land on the beach at Plymouth, not the Mayflower. And then as we come down here, so I should stop for 1 second and say, in my slideshow, what you will see is that Lowell's Boat Shop is really a factory. You think of it as a quaint shop that builds one-off boats, but really it was a mass production facility that built dories. And that started upstairs. If I open that up, you can see there's an upstairs, and that's how the pieces got from the 3rd floor to the 2nd floor. The various pieces of the boats were built up there, and then they would come down, enter the assembly line here, start by taking a bottom, nailing frames on. Where this boat is, it would get planked. And the interesting thing that is unique to the shop, and it's much better in the winter than in the summer, but here is the main building bed. And if you look up through those windows, which you can't really see across the street, the center line of that building bed lines up with the corner of that house across the street. And that house is Simeon Lowell's house, our founder. And that was no mistake. So when you set up the boat to be built, you had to plumb the stem and the transom, and you could visually do that by sighting it on the corner of that house. So the boats would be planked. They would get to the end of the shop here, where the rails and the seats, all that finish work would be done. And then out they would go out the window. So if you see the photo here, you can see them sending boats out a window down to a deck. That deck down there with those Adirondack chairs on it. And now I will take you down into the paint room, where they would paint the boats. And this paint they made here themselves, and it really, I don't believe, would ever dry. And I say that because she get dry. So I think when you made a wooden boat that was going to get used hard, was going to need to be flexible, a flexible paint job is actually a very good thing to have. It kept the boat watertight. And so as you look at this floor here, this is one of our most historic things. Some call it structural paint, but when you get right up close, it's actually very beautiful. That's 150 years of splattered paint. In some places, it's 3 and 4 inches thick. And these were the main ingredients. You had lead paste, turpentine, linseed oil, and then whatever your pigmentation was going to be. In our case, I don't know if you can see this, this is your archaeology. There's modern day, and there's 1860. So in 1860, you have this sort of reddish color. So this paint was pigmented with crushed up bricks from a brickyard downtown. And that's how they got their coloring. It made a very chalky paint that would rub off versus chip off. And so most of the painting was done here by the door, and then the boats would get moved over and over to dry. And you can see as you get further away from the door, the paint on the floor gets thinner and thinner. And I hope you tell the story of Amesbury. So Amesbury was as a town, was a very large boat manufacturer. We were one company of many, and so there's a boat building history to tell. And because they're all boat nuts, I'll I'll head outside here and I'll give you a closer look at the shallop while it's still daylight. This is in the dark, this is our classroom and volunteer space. So we have a number of volunteers that will come a couple of days a week and do woodworking projects. They'll work on the building. They'll even work making some pieces of some boats. So this we had hoped to be launching about now, to be ready for a big event in Boston with the Mayflower, but COVID put a halt to that for a while. What we have done is essentially rebuilt this boat from the waterline down. So it's got a nice new keel, new stern post, all kinds of new frames. You can sneak up inside. And a lot of this wood is actually offcuts from the Mayflower 2, from the Mayflower 2 rebuild down in Mystic. So the Mystic Seaport and Plymouth Plantation have been rebuilding over the past 2 or 3 years, the Mayflower itself. And a lot of this wood comes from the scrap pile from the rebuilding of that boat. And interesting pieces of wood down to it. This new keel here is a piece of yellow pine that was part of a wharf in Connecticut for about 100 years before it got repurposed into this. And I'm sure you Gundalow folks will know this. I do hope. See it better on the other side, perhaps. This knee right here is a piece of wood that came out of the Charlestown Navy Yard, just like the knees that are in the Gundalow that came from the same lot down there. And so we're pretty psyched to be able to use some of that in this boat, they all being historic. So let me take you upstairs and I will show you our current, well, our other 2 current projects anyway. This is again is our museum space, which I encourage you all to come visit. And then this, so we do still build boats. This is a 20-foot surf dory. This will end up in Florida. This one's a little bit unique in that, don't tell anyone. I know the 100 of you will keep mum on this, but the bottom and the garboard, first plank, are made out of this stuff. If you look closely, it's not very wooden. So this is core cell, which is a rigid foam with fiberglass on either side. I'm sending this boat off to a guy who has a wife and 2 or 3 young children. They're gonna take this boat out offshore to snorkel reefs and such in Florida. And I wanted to build them something that had built-in flotation down low in case they ended up full of water and swamped. I didn't want the boat to sink from under them. So that's something new that we're trying. It seems to work pretty well. Time will tell, as it tells with all things. And then the antithesis of that, you have this boat, which is an old dory with a new life. And old dories don't often get new lives because they aren't built to be rebuilt. And this one here was built up in Pemaquid, Maine, in probably the mid to late 20s. It was owned by a family. It was actually owned by the guy that makes your sails for the Gundalow, Nat Wilson. And so his family have had this when he was a boy. He used to row this boat from Fisherman's Island, which is off of Ocean Point, off of Booth Bay. He would row it from there in for groceries and such, because that's where he grew up. And so it was Nat's son's first lobster boat. And now Nat's son has a daughter, and it's going to be her first lobster boat. And so we've replaced the bottom in it, in the transom, and the stem, and a couple of other things. So we're trying to keep as much of great-granddad's old boat as possible while giving it new life and making it safe. And so we do a lot of that. We did just ship out a little skiff that was there. These are the old pieces of that dory I was showing you. This here is on a lake. And then our apprentices, and I will talk about our apprentices in a little bit, have been building this for a couple of years. This is a Haven 12.5, and very similar to a Herreshoff 12.5, which we do have one of those out in the yard as well. But this boat here was begun by a gentleman who pretty soon after beginning it came down with Alzheimer's and never finished. And so his widow donated to us some wood and some molds, and we took it from there. So it's been a very good learning experience for the kids, and not an uncomplicated one. This is a very fussy boat, even for a professional boat builder, let alone high school novices. So I think they're doing a pretty darn good job. But that is the shop. We have just about the best view in town. We sit right on top of the Merrimack River, which is right there. And we get the best sunsets you can imagine. So that there is a look around. I will give you more of the history tour here. I don't know if anybody wants to ask questions on this boat or not. I'll leave that to you, Rich, if anybody has any questions about this. And if not, let's see. Can we get thumbs up? Is this going well so far? Is everyone with me? Oh, look at all those thumbs pop up. Awesome. All right, cheers. So here's what I'll do here. I'm gonna share my screen. Rich, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
I can. You're good.
Okay. And you can see the screen? Full screen?
Yes. Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Well, this is a slideshow that I put together for a talk I did in LA a couple of months ago, just before this began, this whole COVID thing. And the talk was about the craft that we do here. And so we are now considered craftsmen. And I say we boat builders here at Lowell's Boat Shop, really always considered craftsmen, but through much of the history, this was a trade. This wasn't necessarily a craft as we think of a craft today. And so I entitled this Wanted Young Man to Learn Trade, because one of our longest time boat builders actually answered an ad just like that in the Amesbury News and came here to learn how to be a boat builder, and was here for his entire life. So what we'll do is we'll start at the beginning. And I say at the beginning, our founder, who had that house across the street, was practicing as a boat builder in Amesbury as early as 1774. So really, at that time, this was Amesbury, this was Salisbury. And so he was practicing along the Powwow River up in here. The Lowells owned a lot of land over in here, and this was deepish water. You had shipyards, you had wharves, all those kinds of things. This is now a very little waterway, not one that you could bring much more than a skiff up now. So he, in 1793, you can see this was known as Amesbury Ferry. Obviously, Ferry Road stops, picks up again, and this was one of the main thoroughfares north. In 1793, Simeon moved his operation down to here. So I like to show this. This is a chart that the Limeys made in 1776. And the interesting thing is, in this river, it shows quite a bit of detail. It shows obviously a lot of houses right along the river where we are, but also quite a number of wharves. And so you've got even at that time, a pretty active waterfront. So Simeon moved down to here, and this is where we presently are, where I presently am. You're all in your houses watching me here. And what was he doing? So back on the powwow and then here, he was building small schooners like this. This is the schooner Polly, and I love to show this photo, not only because it's the cutest little schooner you've ever seen, but also because it's unique in that it was built in 1805 and lasted long enough to be photographed, and it was built here in Amesbury. So very fortunate for all of those reasons. But it's perfectly representative of the type and size of vessel that was being built right here on the banks of the Merrimack and really everywhere at that time, and the sort of thing that Simeon would have built and worked on. And this is no lie, but we have records that show him making parts and repairing pieces of Gundalows. And this is more of a Merrimack River Gundalow. And these were certainly around in the early 1800s. And these people upriver would take these Gundalows on the outgoing tide down to the marshes between Newburyport and Plum Island. And they'd go harvest salt hay, fill up the Gundalow, and then float it back up to West Newbury and Haverhill and places like that. And so these were in pretty heavy use even down here on the Merrimack River. And Simeon Lowell and the Lowell family would work on these as well. And I'm hoping you all can see, but this is a ledger that we have that dates back to 1805. And this really shows us what Simeon was doing. And what you see here is 3 wherries, 1 wherry, boat, 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 wherry, wherry, boat. So he was building boats and wherries. A wherry is a type of boat, and really, I'll get into this maybe a little bit later, but the best representative of what I think his wherry was is the Piscataqua River wherry, which I think Nate's actually building in the boat shop there at the Strawberry Bank, a replica of one of those. But if you can imagine that, that's the type of boat that he was building. And then these much more complicated ship's boats. And I say that when you see here, a yawl boat, a 20-foot yawl boat costs $50. And a wherry, 1 wherry costs $16. So it's about a third of the money. And so you have to imagine it's about a third of the work to make one of those. And here, I love this. This is the earliest real map of the area that we have that shows what people were doing. And if you look over here, you see D. Lowell Shipyard. This is the Powwow River where I said the Lowells had started their businesses right up along there. And when you focus in, and the reason that I really love this map is that I believe it dates to the 1850s. It still shows this location as a shipyard and not a boathouse, as the succeeding maps will show, which means they were still building ships here. You can see plenty of outbuildings for making the small boats, but really this indicates that the Lowells were still known as shipbuilders. The other thing that you can see is the Lowells own a lot of these houses on the other side of the street too. So at that time, you owned basically the property all the way to the river. And there are still a few of the houses along here that do own the property all the way to the river. So prior to 1860, when you went fishing, say you went out Grand Banks fishing, you would go on a boat like this, something like the Polly, actually, and you'd go find a shallow spot on the bottom offshore. You'd anchor up, and you'd start fishing. Pretty soon, you'd have caught up all the fish around that boat, and you'd have to move it somewhere else where there was more fish. So you see here a ship's boat or a wherry. When the fishing would start to slow down, the captain would send one of the crew members off to row out and check a couple of spots and see where the fishing was good. And once they determined where the fishing was good, they could move the schooner there. Well, it became apparent when the guy in the small boat was coming back with a boatload of fish that, oh, maybe if we took a bunch of these boats out, everybody could spread out and go catch their own fish. And what that did was create a huge demand for a boat that could be taken offshore and used for fishing. So in 1860, Hiram Lowell builds, this is our current building here. That's the Morrill and Flanders shop. And these are the buildings that predated the paint room that I just showed you, but started to build this complex expressly for the construction of bank dories. And a bank dory or a bank dory, and you can see here there's a stack of them, or stacks of them on the riverbank. A bank dory is what you would think of when you think of a dory, except it's got a flat bottom that's shaped like a football. The sides are straight and flaring, which means you could put a straight edge on the inside of the planks and it would hit them all. What that does is allows these things to be stacked. So you can take, in this case, you see 5 of them stacked up here. You can take 10, 12, 14 of these out offshore on the schooner with you fishing, and thereby catch a lot more fish and make a lot more money. The useful life offshore for one of these boats was maybe about 2 years, and then it would be downgraded to inshore fishing, maybe from the beach, for another, I don't know, 3 to 5 years, if that. And by that time, so you can even see the rust already in the laps, the boat was probably too far gone for use for anything other than for a boy to use gunk holing. So with a 2-year lifespan, and every schooner going out has, I don't know, 14 or 16 of these boats on deck, there was a huge demand, and a demand that was cyclical, meaning every couple of years you had to buy a whole new suit of dories. And here is your evolution. So, this is very similar to the Piscataqua wherry that I was telling you about. You have a narrow, flat bottom, and the sides here are very shapely. You even have a hollow here, which is a fairly complicated thing to plank. That then graduated, simplified into this, the round-sided surf dory, if you will. You still have your flat bottom. You still have your shapely sides, but they're a little bit more knuckled, meaning you can build it out of fewer planks that were wider. And then that graduated down here to the bank dory. The bottom's flat, but a little bit wider. The sides are straight, and you can stack one inside the next. You don't usually think of, as time goes by and technology gets greater, of a design actually getting simpler, but that was the case with these dories. So 1860, Hiram Lowell builds 180 dories a year, which is a lot of boats. The processes that needed to be in place in 1860 for that to happen, it was obviously mass production, but it all took place here. Again, you have the fabrication of the pieces of the boats, the assembly of the boats, and then the painting of the boats down there. But like any good business, there was competition. So as I said, we weren't the only game in town. Here you have Hiram Lowell and Sons making fishing dories, and the capital invested in his business was $5,000. Here's brother William, also making fishing dories, but he's only got 20% of that involved. The Kennistons, the Morrills, another Morrill, another Morrill. Sorry, let me go back. My computer's a little confused. So these were all at Salisbury, East Salisbury, as this was known, Salisbury Point, at about the same time. The interesting thing to look at, let's see, is males above 16 years of age. And so, what's the date on this? I can't see it because my thing's in the way. 1879. So in 1879, they were building probably about 13 to 1,500 boats a year. And they were doing so with 6 males above 16 years of age. Greatest number employed at any one time, 8. So whether he was, I don't know, falsifying that for for tax records, I don't know. But I don't know why it says here he's only got 10 full time. Anyway, you slice it, it's not a very big workforce for building that many boats. The other thing to note here is that May to November, your day is 10 hours long, and then November to May, your day is 9 hours long. So we are situated in such a way that when you look out all of our back windows, you're looking south, you have daylight for as much of the day as possible, which was no accident when they built this here. You needed to work by daylight because that was all you had. You weren't going to light up lamps or candles in this building because it certainly would not still be here. So here you have, again, south facing, you have a lot of the Lowell holdings. You've got William Lowell, you've got, you see they're all boathouses, Morrill, Hiram Lowell, and then the Lowells all live across the street here. Then down here you had Arthur True, and then there's another Morrill there, and then down here you had Andrews. So quite a lot of boat building going on right in this stretch of wood, or stretch of the river. And what made that possible, there's a little falls right up here, which ran a sawmill and a planing mill, which fed all of these shops. And when you have that, you necessarily have this. And again, a lot of these old pictures show that's a stack of 6 or 8 dories, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The boats would just start to pile up on the river. This is obviously probably sometime in March, and the ice has been in the river until recently, and they haven't been able to get the boats out. I wish I had a better picture than this of an old photograph in the newspaper, but again, what you see are stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of dories on the riverbank just waiting to get shipped out for use. And so it was just a huge business at the time. Here's young Ralph Lowell. Ralph was the last Lowell to own the shop. You can see 50 dories on that train, and it disappears out of view. And I don't know where those were going, potentially the West Coast. But that became the preferred way after the railroad made it to Salisbury Point of getting dories to where they were going to go. So how do you do it? As I said, this is a depiction of us as a factory. And here you can see a couple of guys making the pieces in the attic. Here's your assembly line on the main floor. And here's your boats being painted. You can see these guys are painting boats with a broom. With history, for anyone that's a historian or runs any sort of historical property, I think you have a lot of history that you've learned through the records that you have, and then you have a lot of history that you've learned from oral history that you've just heard. And so one of the oral history things that I have heard is that to paint a dory, you would basically mix up a bucket of paint, pour it inside, and then push it around with a broom. And then if there was any left, you dump that dory into the next and do the same thing. thereby giving it a single very thick coat of paint that, as I said before, I don't believe ever dried. But you could build them really, really quickly. And here's the other thing. How else did you do it? These shops traded workforce. They traded parts. They traded stuff. This is Main Street. The shop is this way. Other shops are that way. And you can see these guys are, I'm sure somebody had an order, called another shop for a skillet, which is what this is called. This is a dory bottom, stem, frames, ready for planking. Probably called down the street for a skillet. They sold him one, and these are the guys walking it up to the boat shop to be planked up and sold. So they traded labor, they traded materials, and all of these boats, you know, when you have all those manufacturers all in the same place, they're all building the same thing. So it didn't make business sense to build a dory that wasn't going to fit in the next guy's dory, because then you'd have fewer people buying yours. So it made financial sense and business sense for them all to sort of match, and you could buy from anyone. If you were the odd man out, chances are nobody was going to buy your dories. And we also faced, as odd as it might sound, fierce competition from Nova Scotia. There were several dory factories up there that were producing slightly different dories, but at times they were cheaper up in Canada than they were here. And so a boat would leave Gloucester, sail to Nova Scotia, buy 16 dories, and then go fishing because it was less expensive. So the other way you build a whole bunch of dories in a year, and this is 1910 is what I'm talking about, was our biggest year was 1911, and we built 2,029 dories that year, or boats, which is an average of about 7 boats a working day. And at that time, well, just prior to that time, Amesbury was a huge carriage manufacturing center, and the automobile had started to work its way into the market, and there was a little bit of slack capacity in the carriage factory. So they took their workforce, took their machinery, and swapped it over to make dory pieces. And so in the era where Lowell's Boat Shop can produce 7 boats a day, I don't believe you're dedicating much, if any, of your workforce to making the pieces. I think you're essentially doing assembly, in that you're buying your frames, your bottoms, your stems, your transoms, all from downtown factories, you know, by the dozen, by the score, and then just putting them together in your shop where the real skill is needed. Again, we don't have, interestingly enough, we don't have a lot of photographs of the shop. We also don't have a lot of paper records. And I think one of those reasons is that this was a family business from 1793 until 1972. And I think when you have a family business, and it's always been a part of your life, and it's always been a part of your family, I don't think you necessarily revere the old photos and the old records as, say, someone like myself, like a historian who comes in and is just pining for those things every day. Interesting story for all of you, when Ralph Lowell, who was a 7th generation Lowell to own the shop, sold it in 1972, the story goes that he sold it twice. He sold the business to the Odell family, who showed up to start building boats to discover that everything in the building was gone. He sold the contents of the building to Strawberry Bank. And so basically the entirety of the inside of the shop, the old boat patterns, even the benches, the tools, all that stuff was shipped up to Strawberry Bank, and was there from about 1973 until about 1993 or 95. Unfortunately, actually, a lot of it was lost or destroyed in either in the transfer or in the removal from the shop here or by neglect up there. I think there was just so much stuff that the Strawberry Bank couldn't house it all. And eventually, once we became a museum, it all ended up back here. But I think what we ended up with is a fraction, probably, depending upon the entirety of the collection anyway, 50 or 60% of what went up there, which is somewhat of a tragedy. But at the same time that Ralph did that, all of the records from the office went to Ralph's barn, which burned down in the 80s. And so much of the records for this place don't exist any longer, which is why when I see a picture like this, and I'm always looking for them, it's just gold, because you've got the little outhouse that sticks off the back of the building over the river here. You've got the Morrill and Flanders shop and the Lowell shop here. That door that is no longer there. And then you've got this big wide open space and another barn building. All that exists of these now are just little foundations. I also love the ladies in the canoe. And then here you have a retaining wall for the road, and then marsh. This now is the height of the road all the way down to the river, because it's all been filled in over the years. So just a rare glimpse into the past, and also just a rare photo to find. It's really unique. So the business is threatened. Get to 1930, you've got the Depression happening. You're post World War I, and the World Wars led to a lot of mechanization in the fishing industry. And I love this photo because it shows a very transitional time. What you have here, my mouse, what you have here is a schooner that's purely sail. So no engine, it's all under sail. Dories aren't on board, but they would be if it was fishing. And it is right next to a schooner that is partially mechanized. So, or it's mechanized, but it's still partially a schooner. Still got masts, still sails, but probably does most of its going to and fro on engine power. And then you have right over here, this guy probably has a steadying sail, but is really a power boat. And what you're seeing is the death knell, not only of the demand for dories, in that the mechanization, the schooners are about to disappear, but also boats like this are pretty soon about to start dragging the bottom rather than fish from dories. And that really sort of spells the real bottom falling out of the dory market for a lot of these dory builders. So we are still here because we adapted, and many others too in this town adapted. So we started to build pleasure boats. This here is, well, it's a story skiff, I guess, that was built for the Palmer Company. So the Palmer Company sold these. We built the hulls. We sent them down to Connecticut, where Palmer would put an engine in it, and then they would sell it as one of their own. So again, you don't think of wooden boats these days as being manufactured, but they certainly were here. This is a much better representation of that photo. This is, I think, 1953. This was in National Geographic magazine. There's still some demand for dories, and there even is still some demand for dories today. It's not entirely gone. But what you see here, stacks of these are called punts. In the business in this era was building these for camps, Boy Scout camps, Girl Scout camps, things like that. So they just took their ability to make boats and made different boats using the same. This is built just as a dory would be built. It's just a different shape. And again, not the only game in town. So this is us, Hiram Lowell and Sons. Marcus Lowell was next door. That later became Pert Lowell and is still in business in Newbury. Arthur True was just down the street, building these sailboats, which again looks like a completely different boat from a dory. But once you dig into one, and I have had occasion to dig into a few, they are built very much like a dory. And then the powwow craft, these were being built in factories downtown. And this is just a sampling of what was being built here in town. There were a dozen of these types of companies building small pleasure boats in town. Then we're starting to get to the end. So again, the Odells purchased the shop from the Lowells in 1972, and they ran it for another 20 years. But they bought it and they ran it basically with an eye towards preservation more than anything else. I think Mac Odell here lost money every year running the shop just because the business wasn't there. Fiberglass was starting to take over, and you could see the money wasn't there really even to keep the shop up. And as you get into the 80s, they actually had to redesign redesign a lot of these boats because the patterns and everything when they went to Strawberry Bank, so too went the knowledge and the actual patterns for building these. So what the Odells did get was one guy who knew how to build these boats essentially from memory, and he recreated a lot of these designs essentially from the top of his head. And a lot of them are the boats that we still build today. And you can see today, we build fancy little showpiece boats like this, lots of varnish, lots of fine work. And we do that because this is what the market is. Nobody's using a wooden boat really that they didn't build themselves as a skiff to go back and forth to the lobster boat or anything like that. They want these little yachts. And so that's what we build. And we build them using the same methods, the same tools, even in a lot of cases that have been in use here for 100 and 150 years. So that's the history part of it. And now I'm going to get into trade versus the craft. And so I bring you Aubrey Marshall. He was the guy that answered that young man to learn trade ad in the paper in 1927 and spent his life here. And this is me looking as boat buildery as I've ever looked. So back in the day, it was a trade. These guys don't look like tradesmen, and that is because they are the Lowells. This is Hiram, his sons and his grandson. That's Tinky, I believe. Or that's Tinky, sorry. That's William, I think, or Marcus. Anyway, they look this way because they're the business owners. But in order to own this business, you had to know how to build these boats. And so father taught son, and father taught son again, all the way down, because if you didn't know how to build these boats, you couldn't effectively run this business. And then over here, this is Ralph Lowell and Mac Odell. Ralph eventually had to teach Mac Odell and his sons how to build these boats so they could carry on this business. But that was essentially how you learned this. And in this case, it was essentially a life sentence. So you came to work when you were in your teenage years and you picked up a plane. And eventually when dad died, you got to put on a suit and go in the office and start making a little bit more money probably. But you spent your days writing checks and writing letters and corresponding with customers. Which now that I say it has essentially been my progression. I started building boats and now I'm in the office looking at the computer and paying people and doing all that. But this was Fred Tarbox, and this was, he came with the building essentially when the Odells purchased it. And Fred, again, when he was a boy, learned how to build these boats here and did his whole life. And he was the one responsible for recreating a lot of the patterns from memory that we use today, our working patterns. And Fred, again, was here his entire life, almost as if he grew here. And I can tell you from personal experience, once you've built 50 of these things, you do it through rote. You're not really having to think about too much of it. And it truly is a trade if you're building the same boat over and over and over again. It sort of morphs into a craft nowadays for me when I have to custom build something for a customer, or I have to modify a design. It requires a little bit more thought than just taking a pattern, tracing it out, cutting it out, making it part of the boat. Here's also where it becomes a craft. So that boat that I showed you earlier with the Corcel bottom, this is what you use to build it. This is essentially our plan for that boat. We work from patterns to some degree. If you look up here, this has everything you need to know. You start with the bottom. It's 7/8 thick. It's 13 feet long and 30 inches wide in the middle. So I know that I'm going to need 30 inches of width for the boat. If it's 13 feet long, I lay out 13-foot long pieces of wood and I go 6.5 feet and I go out 15 inches on either side, take a batten, make this shape on either side, and there's my bottom. For my stem, it's 1 7/8 oak, and I use a pattern called Big Dory, which is hanging on the wall behind me right now. The timbers, which are the frames, I need 5 of them. They need to be 26 inches apart, and they are the ones labeled 18-foot swamp. My transom is a width of 14 inches at 41 inches. So I know that I'm going to have a triangle. I'm going to come up from the point to 14 inches, or sorry, to 41 inches, come out 7 inches on either side, draw a straight line, and there's my triangle transom. Now the rocker, this might be a new one for you, but the bottom is curved fore and aft. So the forward part of the bottom is 3 3/8 of an inch higher than the middle part of the bottom. And the after part of the bottom is 2.5 inches higher than the middle part of the bottom. So you get a curve fore and aft to the bottom. And then you get to the planking. And these are plank widths taken at the forward station, which is basically the base of the stem, the middle station, the middle of the boat, and aft, which is at the base of the transom. In order to make a plank, you basically trace one edge, you lay out the other edge, cut it out, and just do that all the way up for your 5 planks, garboard 1, 2, 3, 4. And then some other details here. But what you run into when you work with these things a lot, if you look down here, you get stuff like this. May be wrong. So on a lot of these sheets, you get, you get little notes, sometimes in red ink that says no, or, things are crossed out with no explanation, and you don't really know what you're supposed to do or what the note really means. And so you end up having to use, I've had to relearn a lot of things that I would just know if I had occasion to build with Fred Tarbox and he had taught me. And I'm having to learn them through the notes left on a lot of these sheets that were put together by him and by those who he taught. So you would think, having done that I would be a better note keeper, but I'm not. I make a lot of these. I have several of these around the shop, and I don't make additional notes on them because I'm also in an odd place of being a working museum, and really this is an artifact in the museum, but it's also a working piece that I need to build from. But I don't have the hubris that would lead me to modify these at all. What I do is I make copies, and I'll modify those, and sometimes I'll build from them. You also get some generalities, stuff like little nuggets like this. So this was an oral history from Ralph Lowell that someone wrote down, and this is basically the formula for a bank story. So the way you mass produce a boat, all the pieces are the same, you just change the size of the bottom. So here, a 12-foot dory was actually 16 feet overall, go down the line. And this tells you your basic dimensions for the bottom, and it doesn't have any more information than that because the top was always the same. You had the same frames, you planked it the same, so on and so forth. So really all you needed to know was the bottom. But I still, in random file drawers, am finding nuggets like this that are gold, because it gives you some idea of, you would think that a dory had been done and done again, but a real true production dory is really, we don't have any plans for them, so it's hard for a newbie to come in and really know exactly what to do. You can see here, these are the patterns that are throughout the shop that you have to work from. That's for a boat we build called the Atlantic. These are all frames or timbers. These are all stems. And these are some of the various notes that we have to work from. These are my favorite. So that line right there is a transom flare. So the transom flare is the angle of the side of the transom to the bottom. What this would have you do is take your bevel gauge, put it along the bottom of the piece of the paper, and transfer your line from the piece of the paper to your actual piece of wood. The other thing that is interesting here is that I just showed you those patterns. When they developed new models, you can see that's a 10-foot tender, that's a Lowell 12 sailboat. You can see that your stems for a skiff, your timbers are for a 10-foot skiff, so on and so forth. Over here, this is a 12-foot sailboat, it's called, but you use the bottom for a 12-foot Merrimack skiff. You use the timbers for a Swampscott dory. You use the stem for a skiff. So you basically take different patterns for different boats and kind of mash them together to come up with a new design. And they did that quite a bit in the 80s. You can see that's from 85. This here being on yellow paper means it's been verified. You can trust the yellow ones. These ones are maybe one-offs that you can sort of trust. And then getting further down the line, this here is this is actually something that I drew up recording a dory. So prior to the Odells, they didn't even have builder's notes like this. What they had were patterns and then a dory stick. So this is a dory stick for a 12-foot outboard. And what you have on this one stick are the measurements for the distance between frames, which is this. Your, I guess the half breadths of your bottom would all be on this stick. 1, 2, 3 here. Then your planking dimensions here would all be on this stick. So really, if you went to build this boat, all you needed was that stick. You could lay this whole bottom out, take your patterns for your stem, your transom, your frames, and then your rocker, go get the stick again. All your frame measurements are on it. And really, at the end, you have, you end up with the same thing. Now, here's where it also gets confusing. On a round-sided boat, you can see the curvature to the frame. What I'm doing is I'm fairing this by eye. So I've got, the plank is on. I've got these straight edges up for the next plank. So I'm gonna have to cut the frame in a manner that's fair, and the transom here, to accept the next plank. And then when I do the next one, I'll put another straight edge up and I'll cut that part of that frame off, so on and so forth, and make the knuckles all the way up. Nowhere in the notes is there any real guidance for this, and it's really done by feel. And so when you talk about the craft and the artistry of this, it is you've got some measurements to work from, you've got some patterns to work from, but really you're trying to figure it out as you go. And it becomes by feel more than anything else, and therein lies your artistry. And you can see in the last two pictures, I'm using my eye quite a bit. What I'm doing here is I'm spiling this plank. So these edges right here are derived from battens, these curvy pieces of wood. And so what I'm doing is looking at them to make sure that they're fair. And it's all part of the building by eye. Here you can see the batten up on the boat. I'm trying to eyeball that line and space to verify that it's going to look good when it's a plank. And here you have the three options. You have your actual plan for this dory. You've got the notes that I took, and then you've got your dory stick. But if you're a boat builder general, you know how to use that. If you're a boat builder me, you know how to use that. And if you're a boat builder 100 years ago here, you know how to use that. But all three will give you this, which is our standard production Banks dory. And one of our main missions now is preserving and perpetuating this tradition. And so we have an after-school apprentice program that hosts anywhere from 8 to 12 students 3 days a week after school when everyone's not sick. And the idea is to pass these traditions, these feel things onto them so that they don't get lost. I represent a link in the chain just after a very weak link. And so the chain didn't break, but it eroded significantly before I showed up. And I learned from, at least indirectly from some of those who learned from the old timers, but I did not have what you would call a proper training. And I'm loath to let that happen again, and that's why we're trying to do this with our apprentices. Ideally, we're in talks with Trape Academy to build some dories for the Wood Island Life Saving Station next winter with some Trape kids and our own kids here that the station could have, which would be a very cool project. And they are working on the shallop. It's somewhat of an informal program, and I like to keep it that way because you learn a lot of fundamentals in a very structured program, but you don't learn a lot of nuance. This program here, ideally, these students get involved in every step, and we hope start to feel like one of us. And eventually they reach a point, and they of course they had just reached that point this year before we shut down, where they're very independent. You can give them jobs and know that the job's going to be done well. These guys here were actually spiling these planks, which is a complicated thing to do, of getting the shape of the plank out from the boat to the plank, getting it cut out, and they were doing a very good job. And that's a skill that took me years to get trained how to do. And so the fact that they are able to do it I think is amazing, and is just one of the benefits of this program. And the fact that we have cool projects like this to work on is also hugely beneficial. We are trying to create a niche like this, where you have a historic entity like Plymouth Plantation that has this big boat that needs work. We have the capacity to do the work, but we can also do it with students in a learning environment, which is a triple win in all of our eyes. And that'll bring me to the end, where I would be happy to take some questions. I'm going to, well, I guess I am still talking. Here, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see me again. Oh, good. I expected nobody to be there.
Well, Graham, thank you so much for the tour and the history lesson. I think, for me at least, I gained a new perspective on your craft, which started out as a trade. So very cool stuff there. We do have a couple of questions in the chat room, so let me get to those. The first one came from Kit Lord, and the question is, do you have any water-powered machinery in the shop?
We don't, Kit. So we we don't exist on falling water, although it's nearby. What we do have a lot of machinery in the shop that is run by belts, but they're run off of electric motors now. There was a time when they had a steam plant, not in this building, but in a nearby building, that ran shafts, that ran machinery. But really, after, I would say 1880 or 90, when a lot of the part work was outsourced, they didn't need power in here so much, because the work still today is a lot of hand work. There's not that much power machinery that's required. We have table saws and band saws and planers, but a lot of that, the planer especially, is a more recent addition. In the production days, they got wood in two thicknesses, and those were the two thicknesses they used for everything. And so it just wasn't necessary to have.
All right, next question was from Dave Anderson. It says, how does, and this is in quotes, on a lake, end quote, differ from marine service in building? Are there fundamental differences in fit and finish?
How does on a lake differ from marine service? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay.
So
I was asking freshwater. You mentioned a boat going on freshwater. I was wondering how that differs from marine saltwater.
Oh, no, really the only thing I think that would change would be the bottom paint. But everything today is done in copper and bronze, which obviously don't rust. And most of our boats now too, the bottom and the lower plank get encapsulated inside and out with fiberglass and epoxy, so the boats are trailerable. But really, whether it's going on a lake or on the ocean, we don't change anything.
Okay, and then actually Dave had another question. He was wondering about the species of trees for ribs, knees, planking, all conifers, spruce knees, planking of pine, ribs of oak.
Yeah, because I can, I'll pick you up. So that's a good question. Historically, they would have all been pine on oak, probably red oak. For a while, we built with cedar, but cedar is hard to come by in the size that we need. So we're back to using pine for the planking. And so the planking's pine, the rails are oak, white oak, and we use oak for those because you can get it in nice long lengths. The frames are actually, they would historically have been oak, but I use black locust, and I use black locust because we have quite a lot of it around. It's a bit of a weed tree, and it's more rot resistant than oak. And then the transom is almost always some sort of brown jungle wood because it's pretty. And then for hardwoods, I try to use as much locust as possible, again, because I have stacks of it, and it's super rot resistant. It's said to last 1 day shorter than granite. And it's incredibly hard on the tools, but those are your main species. Occasionally we'll use something different. In the case of the shallop, those frames are all live oak because they're cutoffs from the Mayflower. In the case of this dory, I've used Maine cedar for the bottom and for the garboards because that's what was there, and I'm trying to replace everything in kind. But your main planking material is a conifer, is white pine.
All right, and we had one final question that came from Kent Allen, and his question is, have you made a reproduction of a motor launch using an electric motor?
To answer your question, Kent, no, but I have two things to add to that. We have a launch in the next room that needs rebuilding, and it would be a perfect thing for an electric motor. But let me see if I can show you. For the shallop, what we have is this. Oh, you still there? I don't know if you'll be able to see in the box, but down there is a very expensive Torqeedo pod. And so what that is a bolt-on, basically lower unit. If you picture the lower unit from an outboard, it's basically that, but it's an electric motor, and the wires come into the boat and connect to batteries. And for a boat like the shallop, it's going to look old. You're not going to have any sound because it's going to be electric, and the propulsion system will be completely invisible. So it'll still have the look and feel of a very old boat, but it's still very usable. It's a technology that I think is starting to reach the point of being good enough for boats now. I think electrical propulsion.
All right, that brings us to the end of the questions from the chat room. Once again, Graham, thank you so much for giving us the tour and spending the time. I know you're past the hours you normally operate, so we appreciate you spending the time with us. Yeah. For those of you that are still on, I just wanted to let you know that next Thursday evening, we're going to be doing our next virtual Gundalow gathering, which is going to be, interestingly enough, on nautical archaeology. And that you'll actually be surprised at some of the parallels that exist between a Greek cargo ship that was being excavated by our speaker and Gundalows. So if you're interested, tune in next Thursday night at 7 o'clock. Also, just a reminder that this presentation is being recorded and will be available to view again in the next couple of days. Just check back with our website. With that, I'll say good evening, and once again, thanks, Graham. And we look forward to coming back to Lowell's Boat Shop and seeing all the new things you guys are doing.
Yeah, please come visit.
All right. Thank you, everyone.